10th of June, 1940. The last British soldier scrambled aboard a fishing trawler at Dunkirk, leaving behind a continent drowning in swastika banners. Winston Churchill stood in the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, studying maps that showed German forces controlling everything from Norway to the Pyrenees. Britain stood alone, her army evacuated but defeated, her allies conquered or neutral. In that moment of national despair, Churchill made a decision that would birth a legend. He scribbled a note to his chiefs of staff. "We must develop a reign of terror down the enemy coast." Within weeks, a peculiar recruitment began across British military camps. Officers sought volunteers for special service of a hazardous nature. No details were provided, no promises made beyond danger and probable death. Thousands applied anyway. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, an intelligence officer who had watched guerrilla fighters in Palestine and Arab irregulars harass conventional armies with devastating effect. Clark proposed something revolutionary: create small units of highly trained soldiers who would strike German positions across occupied Europe, then vanish like ghosts. The War Office approved his plan on the 23rd of June, 1940, establishing a force that would become known simply as the Commandos. The name itself was borrowed from Boer fighters who had tormented British forces during the South African Wars. Clark understood that warfare had entered a new phase where mobility and surprise could compensate for numerical weakness. Traditional military doctrine emphasized holding ground and massing forces. The Commandos would do the opposite, appearing from nowhere, inflicting maximum damage, disappearing before the enemy could respond. This wasn't merely tactical innovation, but psychological warfare designed to force Hitler to spread his forces thin, guarding thousands of miles of coastline against attacks that could come anywhere, anytime. The first volunteers gathered at irregular warfare training centers in the Scottish Highlands. These weren't typical soldiers, but a cross-section of Britain's most determined men. There was Lord Lovat, an aristocrat who could navigate by stars and lived off the land like a medieval huntsman. Jack Churchill, called Mad Jack, insisted on carrying a Scottish broadsword and longbow into battle. Geoffrey Appleyard, a champion skier and mountaineer, brought alpine warfare expertise. Anders Lassen, a Danish resistance fighter who escaped occupied Denmark, joined seeking vengeance against the Nazis who had enslaved his homeland. Their training was brutal beyond military convention. They learned unarmed combat from Shanghai police instructors who had fought triad gangs. They practiced beach landings until they could scramble up cliffs in darkness while carrying full combat loads. They studied demolition techniques with such thoroughness that a single commando could disable a destroyer or collapse a bridge. Most importantly, they trained to operate independently, with each man capable of completing the mission if his comrades fell. According to historical records maintained by the Combined Operations Command, these early training programs established methodologies still used by special forces worldwide. By autumn of 1940, the first commando units stood ready. They numbered fewer than 2,000 men, organized into independent units called troops, each roughly 50 soldiers strong. They wore the same uniforms as regular infantry, but adopted a distinctive green beret that would become their trademark. Their weapons were standard British Army issue supplemented with whatever they could scrounge or capture. What made them extraordinary wasn't equipment but mindset, a willingness to attempt operations conventional wisdom deemed suicidal. The strategic situation made their creation essential. Germany controlled the entire European coastline from Arctic Norway to the Spanish border. Hitler's forces seemed invincible, his panzer divisions unbeatable, his Luftwaffe unstoppable. Britain needed to demonstrate that Nazi-occupied Europe wasn't an impregnable fortress, but a vulnerable target where determined men could strike at will. The Commandos would become that demonstration, the living proof that Hitler's vaunted Atlantic Wall had cracks through which shadows could slip. 4th of March, 1941. Captain John Durnford Slater led 115 commandos across the English Channel toward the Lofoten Islands, Norwegian archipelago occupied by German forces since the previous spring. Intelligence reports indicated fish oil factories producing glycerin for Nazi explosives. Defended by approximately 300 Wehrmacht soldiers who believed themselves safely distant from British retaliation. The raiders approached in darkness aboard converted passenger ferries, their faces blackened with burnt cork, weapons loaded, and safeties off. They struck at dawn, swarming ashore before the German garrison understood what was happening. Commandos moved through the villages of Stamsond and Henningsare with practiced efficiency, placing demolition charges on oil tanks and factory machinery. The Norwegian civilians, seeing British uniforms for the first time since occupation began, wept openly in the streets. Within 3 hours, destroyed 18 fish oil factories, sank 11 ships, captured 215 German prisoners, and recruited 60 Norwegian volunteers to evacuate to Britain. Not a single commando died in the operation. The Lofoten raid sent shockwaves through German high command. Hitler, furious that British forces had penetrated so deep into occupied territory, ordered immediate reinforcement of coastal defenses. He diverted thousands of troops from other fronts to guard against future commando attacks, exactly the strategic drain Churchill had envisioned. More importantly, the raid demonstrated that German occupation wasn't absolute, that resistance was possible, that the conquered peoples of Europe weren't abandoned. Underground resistance movements across France, Norway, Denmark, and the Low Countries took heart from news that British soldiers were fighting back. German intelligence initially dismissed these raids as isolated incidents, perhaps carried out by desperate refugees or Norwegian resistance fighters. The Wehrmacht had conquered most of Europe with overwhelming force and couldn't conceive that Britain would develop specialized units for what seemed like pinprick attacks. This skepticism was captured in German military communications that later fell into Allied hands, where officers referred to reports of British raiders as propaganda or exaggeration by frightened sentries. The Commandos exploited this disbelief brilliantly, using German assumptions against them. 27th of December, 1941. Operation Archery targeted the Norwegian port of Vagsø, defended by 250 German troops who considered their position secure. Major Jack Churchill led No. 3 Commando ashore, while Royal Navy destroyers provided covering fire. Churchill himself leaped from the landing craft, playing March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes, his broadsword strapped across his back. The Germans, hearing bagpipe music amid explosions and gunfire, initially thought they were hallucinating, or that Norwegian civilians had gone mad. The battle for Vagsø lasted 9 hours of brutal house-to-house fighting. Commandos cleared German positions with grenades and submachine guns, while Norwegian resistance fighters guided them through back alleys and fishing warehouses. The Germans fought desperately, calling for reinforcements from nearby garrisons and Luftwaffe air support. By the time British forces withdrew, they had destroyed industrial facilities, sunk 10 merchant ships, killed over 150 Germans, and captured 98 prisoners. 4 commandos died, but their impact far exceeded their casualties. Documentation from the Imperial War Museum notes that Vagsø convinced Hitler to permanently station 30,000 troops in Norway, troops desperately needed elsewhere. These early operations established patterns that would define commando warfare. They relied on surprise and speed rather than sustained combat. They targeted strategic assets like bridges, factories, and communication centers, rather than attempting to hold territory. They coordinated with local resistance movements, building networks that would prove invaluable for future operations. Most importantly, they created a psychological effect vastly disproportionate to their size, forcing German commanders to see threats everywhere and trust their coastal defenses nowhere. The Germans began developing countermeasures. They increased coastal patrols, installed searchlights and barbed wire on beaches, and created rapid response units to reinforce positions under attack. These defensive improvements came at enormous cost, draining resources from offensive operations in Russia and North Africa. Every German soldier guarding a Norwegian fjord or French fishing village was a soldier not advancing toward Moscow or Cairo. The commandos were achieving Churchill's strategic goal through methods conventional military planners had never imagined possible. 28th of March, 1942. Commander Robert Ryder studied the Loire River estuary from a motor torpedo boat lurking in darkness off the French coast. Ahead lay Saint-Nazaire, home to the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing the Tirpitz, Germany's most powerful battleship. If the Tirpitz could use Saint-Nazaire for repairs and resupply, she could dominate Atlantic shipping lanes and cut Britain's lifeline to America. Ryder's orders were simple and insane. Destroy the dock using a destroyer packed with explosives, knowing most of his men would never return. The HMS Campbelltown, a World War I destroyer considered too old for fleet service, had been modified for this single mission. Her superstructure was cut down to resemble a German torpedo boat, and her bow was packed with 4 tons of high explosives encased in steel and surrounded by delayed action fuses. Behind Campbelltown followed 18 motor launches carrying 611 commandos, demolition experts, and naval personnel. They flew German naval ensigns and responded to challenges in German, buying precious minutes as they approached the heavily defended port. At 1:30 in the morning, German searchlights illuminated the flotilla. Shore batteries opened fire, turning the river into a maelstrom of tracer rounds and explosions. Campbelltown accelerated to full speed, her bow aimed at the massive Normandy dock gates. German gunners poured fire into the approaching destroyer, killing sailors and commandos as they crouched behind inadequate cover. At 1:34, Campbelltown smashed into the dock gates at 19 knots, her bow crumpling exactly as planned, embedding the explosive charge deep into the dock structure. Commandos swarmed ashore while the motor launches attempted to evacuate survivors. German forces responded with overwhelming firepower, destroying most of the small boats before they could withdraw. Colonel Charles Newman led commandos through the port facilities, placing demolition charges on pump houses, winding gear, and submarine pens. They fought running battles through warehouses and along docks slippery with oil and blood. The Germans, realizing they faced a major attack rather than a raid, committed reinforcements including panzer units stationed nearby. By dawn, most commandos were dead, captured, or trapped in Saint-Nazaire, fighting desperate rearguard actions. Newman and the survivors barricaded themselves in a warehouse, ammunition nearly exhausted, waiting for the end. The Germans had retaken the port and captured Campbelltown, sat wedged in the dock gates with hundreds of Wehrmacht soldiers swarming over her, examining what they assumed was a failed attempt to block the entrance. At noon on the 28th, the delayed action fuses detonated. 4 tons of explosives vaporized Campbelltown, the dock gates, and approximately 360 German soldiers who were aboard or near the destroyer. The explosion was so powerful it shattered windows 2 miles away. The Normandy dock, pride of French engineering and Germany's strategic asset, ceased to exist. Twisted steel and concrete blocks filled the entrance, rendering it useless for the remainder of the war. The Tirpitz would never be able to use Saint-Nazaire for repairs or resupply, forcing German planners to keep her in Norwegian fjords where she posed minimal threat to Allied shipping. Of the 611 men who attempted the raid, 169 died and 215 were captured. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for Saint-Nazaire, the highest number for any single engagement in World War II. Records from the British National Archives confirm that German intelligence remained skeptical that such a small force could have caused such destruction, initially blaming French resistance saboteurs rather than acknowledging commando capabilities. The psychological impact on German forces exceeded even the strategic victory. Soldiers stationed along the Atlantic coast now understood that any position, no matter how heavily defended, could be attacked by British raiders willing to sacrifice themselves for mission success. Fortress Europe suddenly seemed far less secure than Nazi propaganda claimed. The legend of the Commandos, dismissed as British propaganda by German high command, became undeniable reality, written in the ruins of Saint-Nazaire. 19th of August, 1942. 5,000 Canadian soldiers, 1,000 British commandos, and 50 American Rangers approached the French port of Dieppe in the largest amphibious assault since Gallipoli, like previous commando raids designed for quick strikes and withdrawals. Operation Jubilee attempted to seize and hold a major port, testing tactics for eventual invasion of France. Lord Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations, had convinced Churchill that such a large-scale raid would provide invaluable intelligence about German coastal defenses while demonstrating Allied offensive capability. Number 3 and Number 4 commando units landed on the flanks at Bernaville and Varangeville with orders to destroy. German heavy artillery batteries that could devastate forces landing on the main beaches. These batteries, equipped with 6-inch guns, commanded the entire assault area from concrete bunkers considered impregnable to naval bombardment. Lord Lovett led Number 4 Commando toward the Hesse battery at Varangeville, his 164 men carrying demolition charges, mortars, and determination honed by 2 years of raids. Lovett split his force into 2 groups, approaching the battery from different directions, coordinating the assault to begin precisely as Royal Air Force Spitfires strafed German positions. His commandos crawled through fields and hedgerows, using darkness and terrain to approach undetected. At 6:30 in the morning, both groups attacked simultaneously. Commandos overwhelmed German defenders in savage close-quarters combat, placing demolition charges on gun breaches and ammunition stores, while Luftwaffe fighters circled overhead seeking targets. Within 90 minutes, the Hesse battery was destroyed, its guns permanently disabled. Levet's force withdrew with casualties of 12 wounded, having eliminated the primary threat to the main landing force. The assault on Dieppe itself became a catastrophe. Canadian troops landing on the main beaches encountered German defenses far stronger than intelligence had suggested. Machine gun nests positioned in hotels and clifftop bunkers created interlocking fields of fire that turned the beaches into killing zones. Churchill tanks intended to support the infantry became trapped on the shingle beach, unable to climb the seawall or maneuver under heavy fire. German artillery that should have been neutralized pounded landing craft and troops pinned down in the open. By mid-morning, it became clear the operation had failed. Troops ashore were being systematically destroyed, unable to advance beyond the seawall or even reach their primary objectives. The decision was made to evacuate. But German forces now controlled all beach exits and high ground overlooking the withdrawal routes. Landing craft attempting to rescue survivors ran gauntlets of machine gun and artillery fire. Canadian soldiers fought desperate rearguard actions, selling their lives to buy time for comrades to escape. The final casualty figure shocked Allied command. Of approximately 5,000 Canadians who landed, 1,027 died and 1,946 were captured. Total Allied casualties exceeded 4,000 from a force of 6,000. Only the commando flanking operations succeeded, both units completing their missions and withdrawing with minimal losses. The contrast between commando success and conventional assault failure provided brutal evidence about the nature of modern coastal defenses and the impossibility of capturing a defended port through frontal assault. German propaganda celebrated Dieppe as proof of Allied weakness and the impregnability of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Newsreels showed captured Canadians being marched through streets while Wehrmacht soldiers posed with destroyed tanks and abandoned equipment. Hitler personally congratulated the defenders and ordered additional fortifications constructed along the entire coastline. German generals, studying the battle, concluded that amphibious invasions against prepared defenses were suicidal, that the Allies would never risk another landing against Fortress Europe. These conclusions, while seemingly validated by Dieppe's casualties, were precisely wrong in ways that would prove catastrophic for German defensive planning. Allied planners learned invaluable lessons about amphibious warfare, the necessity of overwhelming naval and air bombardment, the importance of specialized landing craft and equipment, the impossibility of capturing a defended port intact, and the need for artificial harbors to supply invasion forces. Most importantly, they learned from the commandos that small, highly trained units could accomplish objectives that conventional forces could not, that mobility and surprise remained viable even against prepared defenses. Historical analysis published by the Royal United Services Institute notes that without Dieppe's painful lessons, the Normandy invasion might well have failed with casualties dwarfing those suffered on the French beaches in 1942. 27th of December, 1943. 10 Norwegian commandos parachuted into the Telemark region, descending through darkness into one of the most isolated areas of occupied Europe. Their target was the Vamork hydroelectric plant, where German scientists were producing heavy water essential for atomic weapons research. Previous attempts to destroy the facility had failed, including a glider assault that ended in disaster when both gliders crashed in the mountains, killing or capturing all participants. This time, the mission fell to Norwegians, who knew the terrain intimately and could survive conditions that would kill soldiers from temperate climates. The team designated Operation Gunnerside, led by Joachim Ronberg, a 23-year-old lieutenant who had escaped Norway after the German invasion and trained with British commandos in Scotland. His men were cross-country skiers capable of covering 50 miles daily through mountain wilderness. Hunters who could navigate by landmarks invisible to outsiders and saboteurs trained in demolition techniques by British intelligence. They carried plastic explosives, weapons wrapped in waterproof covers, and rations sufficient for 2 weeks in sub-zero temperatures. Reaching Vamork required crossing the Hardanger Vita, a mountain plateau where winter temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, and snowstorms could blind travelers within minutes. The commandos skied through conditions that had defeated Wehrmacht patrols. Their Norwegian heritage and training allowing them to survive where German soldiers would freeze, They reached a resistance safe house on the 5th of February, 1944, where they met for survivors of the previous mission who had been living in the mountains for months, evading German search parties. The combined force of 14 men studied German security arrangements through binoculars from mountain overlooks. Vemork sat at the bottom of a steep valley, surrounded by cliffs, and approached only by a heavily guarded suspension bridge and a single access road. German security included minefields, floodlights, guard posts, and regular patrols. The facility itself was built into the mountainside, with the heavy water production cells located in the basement of an industrial complex employing several hundred Norwegian workers. Any assault would require penetrating multiple security layers, placing demolition charges in a specific room, and escaping before German reinforcements arrived. On the night of the 27th, the Commandos descended the cliff face using ropes, climbing down 600 feet of ice-covered rock in darkness. They reached the factory grounds undetected, cut through a chain-link fence, and entered through a basement door that Norwegian resistance had deliberately left unlocked. Inside, they navigated through tunnels and corridors to the heavy water concentration room, where 18 cells produced the precious liquid. The night watchman, a Norwegian sympathizer, allowed them to pass without raising the alarm. Ronberg and his demolition expert placed plastic explosive charges on each concentration cell, carefully positioning them to destroy equipment while minimizing risk to the factory workers sleeping in dormitories above. They set 30-second fuses, lit them with calm precision, and evacuated the building. The explosion came exactly on schedule, a muffled crump rather than a spectacular detonation. When German security forces rushed to investigate, they found destruction so complete that heavy water production would be impossible for months. By then, the Commandos had climbed back up the cliff and disappeared into the mountains. The Germans initially suspected sabotage by Norwegian workers rather than a military operation. The absence of casualties and the precise nature of the demolition didn't match their expectations of commando raids, which they assumed would involve massive explosions and sustained combat. Only after Norwegian intelligence operatives were captured and interrogated did German authorities realize British-trained commandos had penetrated their supposedly secure facility. Hitler, apoplectic with rage, ordered immediate execution of any captured commandos and collective punishment of nearby Norwegian communities. The Vemork raid remains one of the most successful sabotage operations in military history. German atomic weapons research, already hampered by resource shortages and theoretical disagreements, never recovered from losing access to heavy water production. When the Allies finally developed atomic bombs in 1945, German scientists were still years from achieving controlled nuclear reactions. Historical records from Los Alamos National Laboratory indicate that Allied intelligence considered the Norwegian commandos' destruction of heavy water production a significant factor in ensuring the Manhattan Project completed its work before any potential German atomic program. 6th of June, 1944. While thousands of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history, small groups of commandos landed in darkness hours before the main assault. Their missions were precision strikes against specific targets that could devastate the invasion if left operational. Coastal batteries, communication centers, bridges, and strongpoints positioned to enfilade the landing beaches. These were the missions that for years of raiding had prepared them to execute. The culmination of Churchill's vision transformed into strategic reality. Number 4 Commando, led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Dawson, landed at Sword Beach with orders to capture Weestrom, a fortified town controlling access roads from the beaches. German defenders had transformed the town into a fortress, with machine gun nests and houses, artillery positions and concrete bunkers, and a casino converted into a strong point, bristling with weapons. The commandos attacked before dawn, using techniques perfected through dozens of raids, small teams bypassing strong points, demolition charges, eliminating bunkers, close quarters, combat clearing buildings room by room. Lord Lovett's 1st Special Service Brigade landed with bagpiper Bill Millen playing Blue Bonnets over the border as bullets churned the water around him. Lovett had ordered Millen to pipe the commandos ashore despite regulations forbidding pipers in combat, believing the music would steady his men and unnerve the Germans. The psychological impact was exactly as intended. German defenders, accustomed to fighting through artillery barrages and aerial bombardment, were confronted by soldiers advancing to the sound of bagpipes, an image so incongruous it momentarily disrupted their defensive coordination. The Commandos' objective was linking up with British airborne forces holding the Orne River bridges against German counterattacks. These bridges were vital for Allied forces pushing inland, and German commanders understood that recapturing them would isolate paratroopers and potentially collapse the entire eastern flank of the invasion. Lovett's brigade fought through German positions, advancing with speed that conventional infantry units couldn't match, arriving at the bridges just as German armor prepared to overwhelm the airborne defenders. The arrival of fresh commandos with anti-tank weapons turned the battle, holding the bridges until armored reinforcements arrived from the beaches. Throughout the Normandy sector, commando units were accomplishing objectives that planners had designated as critical to invasion success. They eliminated coastal batteries at Merville that could have enfiladed Sword Beach, destroying guns in pre-dawn assaults that conventional forces would have attempted with massive artillery preparation, and frontal attacks costing hundreds of casualties. They secured flanks, eliminated strong points, and created chaos in German rear areas through raids and ambushes that multiplied their actual strength through German commanders' uncertainty about where commandos might appear next. German defenders, facing invasion on a scale that dwarfed their worst nightmares, initially dismissed reports of commando operations as confusion or exaggeration. After 4 years of raids, Wehrmacht intelligence had concluded that British commandos were a small force incapable of sustained operations, useful for propaganda, but militarily insignificant. Discovering commando units operating throughout the invasion sector, accomplishing missions with precision and aggression, forced German commanders to recalculate their assumptions about Allied capabilities and intentions. The myth that Germans thought commandos didn't exist or were British propaganda had basis in German intelligence assessments from 1940 through 1942. Military communications captured after the war revealed that Wehrmacht officers frequently attributed commando raids to various other sources: Norwegian resistance, British regular infantry, your special air service, which was actually a separate organization, or simply fabricated British propaganda claims about raids that never occurred. This institutional skepticism served Allied interests perfectly, causing German defenses to be unprepared for the actual capabilities and reach of commando operations. By 1944, German military intelligence had comprehensive files on commando operations, but the damage from years of underestimation couldn't be reversed. Forces that should have been available for mobile defense were scattered along coastlines, guarding against raids that might never come. Defensive positions were designed to resist frontal assault rather than infiltration by specialized troops. Most critically, German commanders had learned to distrust coastal defenders' reports of British raiders, assuming exaggeration or panic, a habit that left them unprepared when commandos appeared during the invasion in numbers far exceeding previous operations. Historical analysis by the German Bundesarchiv indicates that commando operations forced the Wehrmacht to maintain coastal defense forces equivalent to 20 divisions that could have reinforced critical theaters. 1st of May 1945, while European newspapers proclaimed Hitler's death and the collapse of Nazi Germany, commando units were already deploying to Asia, where war continued against Japanese forces, occupying vast territories from Burma to the Pacific Islands. The tactics perfected in Norway and France translated imperfectly to jungle warfare, but the fundamental principles of speed, surprise, and precision targeting remained valid. No. 5 Commando landed on the Arakan coast of Burma, tasked with eliminating Japanese artillery positions dug into hillsides overlooking Allied landing zones. The jungle environment posed challenges different from European operations. Vegetation so thick that visibility extended mere feet, humidity that rotted equipment and sapped strength. Diseases like malaria and dysentery that could incapacitate soldiers as effectively as enemy fire. Japanese defenders employed camouflage and defensive techniques honed through years of jungle warfare, creating positions virtually invisible until attackers were within grenade range. Traditional commando tactics of rapid assault and withdrawal became problematic when withdrawal meant cutting through miles of pathless jungle, while Japanese patrols hunted pursuers. The commandos adapted, learning from Chindit long-range penetration groups and incorporating techniques from indigenous forces who fought the Japanese throughout occupation. They adopted lighter equipment, modified weapons for jungle conditions, and developed new infiltration methods suited to dense vegetation. Rather than amphibious landings from the sea, they increasingly used rivers and streams as approach routes, traveling in native boats that could navigate shallow waters inaccessible to conventional landing craft. They worked closely with Karen and Chechen resistance fighters, who provided intelligence and guided commando patrols through territories where white faces would otherwise be instantly visible to Japanese observers. Operation Balsam on the 15th of May 1945 demonstrated evolved commando capabilities in the Asian theater. 36 men from No. 5 Commando inserted by submarine off the coast of Japanese-occupied Malaya, tasked with destroying a railway bridge that carried supplies to Japanese forces in Singapore. They came ashore in rubber boats at midnight, cached their equipment in jungle hideouts prepared by local guerrillas, and spent 3 days reconnoitering the target while Japanese patrols passed within feet of their concealed positions. The assault came at dawn on the 18th, timed to coincide with shift changes at the bridge guard post, when defenders would be tired and distracted. Commandos eliminated sentries silently using commando knives and suppressed weapons, placed demolition charges on bridge supports, and set delayed fuses, allowing them to reach the extraction point before explosions alerted Japanese forces. The bridge collapsed into the river 35 minutes later, blocking the railway line for weeks, while Japanese engineers struggled to construct temporary spans. All 36 commandos reached the submarine rendezvous and evacuated successfully. These Asian operations lacked the publicity of European raids, but were equally significant strategically. Japanese supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle, vulnerable to interdiction by forces that could appear anywhere and strike before defenders could react. Commando raids forced Japanese commanders to divert troops to guard installations that might never be attacked, weakening frontline forces facing conventional Allied offensives. Each successful raid convinced local resistance movements that Japanese occupation wasn't permanent, encouraging continued resistance and sabotage. The European experience provided both advantages and limitations for Asian operations. Commandos arrived in theater with institutional knowledge about raid planning, amphibious tactics, and demolition techniques unavailable to troops without special operations experience. However, they also arrived with assumptions shaped by European warfare that sometimes proved dangerous in Pacific contexts. Japanese defenders fought with fanaticism that exceeded German tactical doctrine, preferring death to surrender and employing suicide tactics that shocked even veteran commandos accustomed to Wehrmacht professionalism. Intelligence about Japanese positions was often less reliable than European theater intelligence, forcing commandos to operate with greater uncertainty about enemy strength and dispositions. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on the 6th of August and Nagasaki on the 9th of August. 1945 ended the Pacific War before commando units could participate in the planned invasion of Japan. Plans existed for commando raids against Japanese home islands, targeting coastal defenses and communication centers in advance of amphibious assaults. These operations would have been suicidal, as facing a fanatical enemy fighting for their homeland against forces they had been conditioned to view as demonic invaders. The cancellation of these